Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your support.
Yeah. Anything on your mind lately?
Yeah, mostly what's on my mind right now is a talk that I have to give tonight at Linfield College, which I suspect will be rife with protests and controversy. So
Yeah.
that happens at 7 o'clock tonight. So that's on my mind as well as a number of other issues. But
I
that's
saw
the pressing issue.
I saw one, I forget what the college was named, where there were people that kind of came into the classroom where you were giving a speech and making a lot of noise and yelling things.
Yes, that was
Your
at McMaster
Yeah,
University.
yeah, I saw the live stream of that. Your composure was super impressive during that. It was very
Well,
inspiring.
it's not always easy to tell when something is going well and when it's going badly, because it's possible that that was the best possible outcome of that talk.
Yeah, sure.
Because one of the things I've noticed about dealing with the radical social justice types is that if you just leave them be, they um, they reveal themselves both as extreme and as incompetent. And so the fact that that can be publicized partly through documenting it is conceivably as good an outcome as you could hope for.
The incompetency part is kind of blowing my mind lately. Not just with those sorts of people, but with lots of people who are very loud in different sorts of environments. For me, I am kind of obsessed with Bitcoin lately.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, I work for a Bitcoin brokerage, and I spend a lot of my time just keeping up with what's going on. And there's a lot of serious incompetency in that industry that gains a lot of attention and funding, and it's hard to tell sometimes if it's like intellectual dishonesty or straight incompetence,
yeah. Well, it's often not that easy to distinguish between those things.
right? I want to ask you something about the Gulag Archipelago that relates to this.
Okay,
Um, there was someone named Gordy that was mentioned who was a writer.
Gorky.
Gorky, yeah, I think it was Gorky. I wrote,
Yeah,
yeah. So he was talking about how Gorky visited some of the work camps, and they did make the people who worked there did make they put a lot of effort into making the work camp seem like a nice place to be
yeah,
for the
yes.
prisoners.
They called those Potemkin villages, and they used to do that to Western writers who came too.
Okay.
Like I think Bertrand Russell visited at one point and
Oh.
was completely struck by how remarkable the Soviet system was, because they would do exactly that, and they would threaten people very intensely to not reveal about what the consequences would be if they revealed any of the actuality. And the Nazis did that to some degree with one or two of their camps. There was a camp they set up early. The name, I think it was Teresian, although that might be wrong, where they put artists and other creative people, and they used that, if I remember correctly, as a model camp to so that outsiders could view it and as a part of their propaganda scheme. But the Soviets were particularly good at that.
It seemed like Solzhenitsyn, he kind of hinted that maybe Gorky knew better. Like there were some things that happened where he should have been a bit alarmed about the conditions there. And it seems like to me it would be obvious that that's not going to be a nice place for the prisoners. Do you think he was really fooled, or was it intellectual dishonesty when he would say how great the Soviet system was with his other writers? There's Solzhenitsyn talks about a scene where they're on a yacht, all of the writers together on a boat talking about
Yeah,
that system, and it's just so you can imagine them on the yacht having a wonderful time with
yeah.
like some serious intellectual masturbation going on.
Yeah, well, one thing I've learned even more, I would say deeply, because of the events that have transpired around me in the last 6 months, is that it's very almost impossible to overestimate the degree to which people will not stick their neck out. And so even in the West, where the the consequences for doing so are trivial compared to what they are in a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
It's much easier for people to not say what they think and to live in a somewhat artificial manner. I mean, I've had many people come up to me, and many more write me, saying that they agree with what I'm saying and what I'm doing, but that they're too afraid to manifest any of that agreement in their workplace or in their social life because of the potential repercussions. And it's odd because it's a very small minority of people who are actually the radicals that I've been talking about. It's the majority of the people aren't like that, but it's quite easy for a noisy minority to intimidate a larger majority, especially if they're organized. It doesn't take that many of them, especially if they're willing to, attack as a unit.
Yeah.
And so, well, that relates back to Gorky. I mean, he had a very privileged and high status position within the Soviet Empire, and he was a preferred writer and had everything that was associated with that. And you could imagine that he would have had to make a million small compromises along the way in order to have been granted that. And by the time you've made a million small compromises, you put yourself in a situation where admitting one large truth would be fatal.
Yeah.
So when he went to these places, he would have both seen and not seen, because he'd be practiced at not seeing. And you get good at what you practice at.
Right.
And you were relating that to some degree to what you were seeing at Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's not the stakes are not nearly as high, but there are, scams happening and people investing money into things that have no value whatsoever. And yeah, it seems like it's either serious intellectual dishonesty or serious incompetence on the people who are organizing those sorts of fundraisers and whatnot.
Yeah, well, there's a dictum called, I think it's Hanlon's razor, which states, assume incompetence before malevolence.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's easy to also note that malevolence exists. So you start with incompetence, but if that isn't a sufficient solution, then the next thing I think you look at is willful blindness. I could know, but I choose not to.
Which is really damaging, right?
Oh yes, that's a rough one.
It seems like, like as far as the Soviet Union goes, maybe 95% of the people were like that. Like, not too many of them were actually, I don't know, not too many of them were in the employ of the government agencies who were rounding people up and sending them to the gulags or the prisons, but everyone turned a blind eye, I guess, out of fear.
Fear and habit. Yeah, as you do that more and more, you get weaker and weaker, and so the probability that you'll continue to do it increases and the danger increases. It's a really nasty spiral.
And so one of the things you've talked about is that you're always honest.
Well, I wouldn't say that I am, but I certainly try not to say things that I believe to be false.
Right.
I mean, you have to be very careful about claims to be honest because.
Yeah, that's my bad. I just worded that wrong.
Yeah, well, no one is entirely without flaws in the way they live and in the way they speak, but I do try to do that because I've learned that if you want to rely on yourself as a guide through life, then you don't want to corrupt your perceptions and your thoughts because then you become untrustworthy and then who do you have to rely on?
Yeah.
You're lost. Maybe you rely on an outside authority, but that's not for the best.
Okay, another question coming from Gulag Archipelago. Something that Solzhenitsyn said a few times was that the prisoners could tell when someone was a stool pigeon, what they called an informant, right?
Yeah.
There was a quote of his is, I don't think I fixed this quote. something like, and your eyes purified by suffering infallibly perceive the least haze in other eyes, for example. Right? So it's like he claimed a few times that just looking in someone's eyes and they would know who the informants were. Do you believe that? Do you think that he might be exaggerating, or maybe there's some like bias there, or do you think that people are possibly capable of determining that?
I'm loath. Just hang on a sec. My computer's getting weak here. I just have to plug it in.
Yeah, no problem.
There we go. Well, I'm loath to dismiss anything that he says, and also it's very difficult to understand exactly how people transform when they're in serious chronic danger and under exceptional conditions of privation. I suspect that partly what happens under those conditions is that you develop a kind of hypervigilance, and that you see this with paranoid people sometimes, is that they're much better at detecting slight shifts in emotion in people because they're so unbelievably vigilant. Like they're just looking at absolutely everything you do. It's very physiologically costly, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's sort of, if an exaggeration of normative perception of emotions was part and parcel of being in an extreme condition.
Yeah.
Because your nervous system, you're already under assault to such a degree that any additional danger is likely to tip you right over the edge. And so the probability that your vision is sharpened and that there are things that go by, I would say, is very, very high.
Yeah.
Have you ever been in a car accident?
Yeah.
Did time slow down? Did you know what was going to happen?
I suppose time seemed to slow down, yeah.
See, that's a fairly commonly reported occurrence, and I think what happens is that you get a very rapid rush of adrenaline, and then your clock rate speeds up by like 5-fold, and that means that for that brief moment of time, you're capable of actions that you wouldn't normally be capable of doing. Now, the price you pay for that is tremendous physiological draining.
Yeah.
But, it's hard to tell what we're capable of in emergencies. Certainly, we're capable of things that we're not capable of when it isn't an emergency.
Yeah. The adrenaline, is it simply the adrenaline that helps us do those things, or is it more complicated?
Well, I mean, the adrenaline is certainly, I would say, the proximal basic cause, but exactly what that means neurologically and physiologically, we just don't know enough about to make a complete account. It's pretty hard to study people's reactions under emergency conditions, because first of all, they only last for a very short period of time, and second, it's not that easy to put people into a plausible emergency without doing things that are really unethical.
Yeah, right. Do you mind if I record this, by the way?
Go ahead.
I should have asked you that in the beginning, but...
What do you have plans for the recording?
I would like to just put it up on YouTube. I don't have any sort of audience or anything like that. So.
Well, let's see how it goes, and if you still feel that way when we're through our conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Okay.
I haven't really done anything like that, so. There was something else Solzhenitsyn said that was pretty interesting to me. He was talking about prisoners who stayed loyal to the Soviet ideology while they were locked up. He said they needed ideological arguments in order to hold on to a sense of their own rightness. Otherwise, insanity was not far off.
Right. I remember that line.
It's really crazy. I mean, there were people who had been suffering there for 5 years or more who just believed if Stalin himself knew about their situation, he would set everything right. Like they kept that belief, and it never made sense to me until that line, because insanity is something that do you think that we have defense mechanisms against that? Is that something that we want to avoid naturally? It seems like
I would say, like the defense that Solzhenitsyn there is talking about proximal defense mechanisms. No, I mean, for the people who were committed to communism, the real committed types, that was the value system around which they had organized their entire life. And so they let go of the axiomatic assumption that the system was basically good, but unfortunately flawed in their particular case. Do what Solzhenitsyn did, and that was undergo the process that the Christians used to call metanoia, which was a complete revaluing of their previous life. Because their previous life was all oriented utopian goal and was buttressed with beliefs in the ultimate value of the system, and that provided the framework within which all of their actions were interpreted. And then to doubt that means that you have to go back over your life with a fine-tooth comb, and that is what Solzhenitsyn said that he did, and figure out, given that was wrong, that central assumption, what else did you do that was wrong? And Solzhenitsyn talked about going back to his earliest memories and essentially combing through his entire life, and that is what those people would have had to do. That's very, very effortful, and the way you avoid it is just by not doing it. It doesn't happen automatically. It's effortful. And so in some sense, they're like people who suffered from like a neurological disorder that makes it unable for them to notice that something's gone wrong with their body. They have this great flaw, but it's impossible for them to engage in the calculations that would be necessary to set it right. So you could imagine that someone like that would need a confidant, even someone they could talk to, and because people also think by talking, they need a confidant to talk to, perhaps for dozens of hours or maybe even hundreds of hours to sort all that back out. I've seen clients in therapy, for example, who've been theoretically married happily and stably for many years, and then find out that their partner has committed an act of infidelity or is having an affair, and it's devastating to them. It's traumatic, and part of that is because it casts everything they believe into doubt.
Yeah.
And then they have to reformulate it, not only the past but also the present and the future, because that's all tangled together, and it's very, very effortful. They have nightmares, and they're terrified, and they're depressed, and they're angry. So all those emotions come up, and then they just have 10,000 things to think through. And a lot of that has to occur in dialogue, because people are often not capable of doing that heavy lifting all by themselves. So it's easier to cling to the damaged shreds of the past. But as Solzhenitsyn said, you sacrifice your soul if you do that, because now it's not true. Yeah. Before you could convince yourself, but now you know.
He called himself a murderer. He said that when he was in command, the decisions he made were murderous or something like that. But he admitted to being a murderer at some point. This is kind of a heavy question. I don't know if it's even appropriate to ask, but do you think that he participated in the rape of German women?
I don't have any evidence for anything like that.
It would have been somewhat normal. He says it was normal for the Soviet soldiers. The protocol was if they came across German women, they could rape and shoot them. But
oh yes. I mean, it was like there was no normal in the Soviet invasion of Germany, right? It was absolute chaotic mayhem.
Yeah.
So God only knows how a person would react in a situation like that. Or you do know to some degree, because you know the accounts.
Yeah.
And like a man in battle, full out, is nothing like a man who's civilized, who in civilization. They're not the same creature.
I see. Yeah.
Their whole different circuits turn on, and well, that's where absolute mayhem can rule, and it certainly did when the Soviets went into Germany. So who knows what he meant, what he had been involved in.
But it's safe to say that he did some bad things.
Yes, well, he said himself that he did some things that he regarded from his own moral perspective as, unforgivable, essentially.
Right.
But war, of course, is a time when you do things that are unforgivable.
Yeah. Especially that kind of circumstance, the Russian-German thing.
Right. Right, especially that kind of circumstance.
Yeah. Have you experienced being a therapist? Have you known people who have done terrible things and you know them now to be good people?
I suppose it depends on what you mean by terrible. I've certainly known people who have done things that they regarded as terrible.
I think from your own subjective belief system,
I've never worked with someone who has done anything as terrible as outright murder.
Yeah.
But I've worked with people who have done things in their lives that certainly have devastating impacts on others, or have experienced those. It's hard for people to put themselves back together after that, especially if they're conscientious people.
After they've committed some sort of...
Yeah, but to a lesser or greater degree they can. And that does occur, I think, through the process that Solzhenitsyn outlined in Gulag Archipelago, is that it requires a careful going over of memory and an analysis of error and a determination to live properly in the future. And, hurt, I would say, and maybe broken like Humpty Dumpty so that you're never quite put together again, but humbler and perhaps more able to serve the good in a more alert and awake way. That's repentance,
Right.
And so that's the pathway to regaining your life, is repentance and transformation and the vow to do better. That's done in a micro way in a Catholic confession.
Right.
You go in, you say, look, if you're doing it seriously, it's an easy thing to parody, because you can parody something doesn't mean it lacks all value. The idea is that while you're supposed to be striving to be a good person and you fall short by your own account, and then you go talk to someone about that. You say, well, this week, here's a bunch of things I did that were wrong, either by the church's dictate or by the dictates of your conscience. And then, the agents of the church extend forgiveness to you, which is something remarkable about Catholicism. It's something Jung talked about a lot. It's because Catholicism is always often considered a rather tyrannical doctrine, but it does offer people a weekly pathway to reconciliation, which is a big deal. People carry around secrets, and this is something Jung thought of as a weakness of Protestantism, is that the Protestants are stuck with their sins with no way of cleansing themselves, whereas the Catholics sort of get a new chance every week. And, you can say, well, that's just too easy, isn't it? But that's a bit cynical when you know how flawed people are and how many mistakes they make. It's not such a bad thing to allow them to clean themselves off now and then and try again.
Yeah. And Solzhenitsyn seemed like he said that he appreciated his prison term because of his chance to repent.
Right.
Which was pretty damn profound.
Yes, no kidding. Well, it gave him time to think.
Yeah.
And that's a funny thing, because the purpose of a prison, a penitentiary, was to provide people with a place to be penitent, right? So that you take someone who's done terrible things with their life and you isolate them so they can think about it. That's the theory. So that because the prisons were established within a Christian context, and so imprisonment was a place of solitude for contemplation and eventual potential reconciliation. That's why they're penitentiaries. Now, obviously, they weren't set up with the total absence of punishment in mind. I mean, everything that people do has multiple motivations, political and psychological. One of the functions of the penitentiary was to allow people to undergo that transformation, and I suspect some of them do. But you need that time, or perhaps it's, if your life isn't being conducted properly, it's a blessing perhaps to have the time to contemplate what you're doing and to straighten it out.
Yeah.
I mean, just in a minor way, there's a book written a while back called Managers, Not MBAs, which was a decent analysis by a professor at McGill about the proper training of executives and upper management staff. He would take them to retreats, part of their MBA program, and one of the advantages the retreats offered was that they just had time away from their work and the fires they were putting out every day, just to sit back and think about what they were doing in the medium to long term.
Yeah.
And that it's quiet contemplation time that you need for that. And of course, people are so extraordinarily busy in their normal lives that time just doesn't exist. Whereas Solzhenitsyn said that in the camps, of course, you had nothing but time, an excess of time.
Yep. Yeah, he
and
did say that.
He derived the advantages from that.
Yeah.
And then the world derived the advantages from that because he wrote that book. It's amazing. It's an amazing story.
He memorized this book.
I know. It's unbelievable. Yeah. It's unbelievable.
So he said there was a Christian poet that he spent time with. I can find his name quickly if you don't remember him. He said he had something like 20,000 lines of verse memorized.
Mm.
And that they all had different tricks for doing this. Solzhenitsyn had like a rosary that he used, and he would count the lines and kind of just mark significant lines every 100th count or so, and make sure that he kept those significant lines in check every time he did the count. Do you remember who that Christian poet was?
I don't, but I do know that like pre-literate people typically have memories that have that kind of capacity, because of course they can't write anything down, and so those feats seem completely improbable to modern people. But
yeah,
you know, even back when people lived in communities that only had oral traditions, there were specialists in the communities that would memorize the entire tradition. And then it would be handed down, you know, generation after generation with a fair bit of fidelity. And that was aided by the use of poetry, because poetry is easier to remember because it has a beat, and you know, there's internal relationships that help you, that serve as memory cues. That's really, in some sense, what poetry is for. It's not the only thing that it's for, but things are constructed poetically as aids to memorization. And in the Bible, a lot of the verses are especially the ones that are repetitive, and in ancient stories like the Enuma Elish, there's constant repetition of lines, and that's because they weren't written, they were spoken, and they were sort of halfway between a story and a song, and that way people could remember them far more easily.
Yeah.
You know, it's much easier to remember the lyrics of a song frequently.
Sure, yeah. Than a book, yeah. Do you have any advice for... I personally can identify with that description of people who are just too busy.
Mm-hmm.
I work a lot. My work is intellectually challenging. I have 3 kids and land and animals to maintain and whatnot.
Oh yeah, that sounds like a lot.
Yeah, it's really stressful, and I'm finding it hard to maintain without really cutting corners in places I don't want to cut corners.
Yeah. That could be a real problem when you get overloaded, and you're right in the thick of things. How old are your kids?
Between 1.5 and 6.5.
Oh yeah, right. So yeah, you've got plenty going.
Yeah.
And you said you have land and animals?
Yes.
What animals?
I have dogs mostly. We have some rabbits and chickens and horses, but I don't do much of the work for those guys. The dogs, I kind of have to. We have coyotes around us, and the coyotes have eaten our dogs before.
Uh-huh.
We have puppies right now, so I have to be pretty vigilant about that, just maintaining the fence line and things like that. It's
Yeah, well, the only really good advice I know about operating under conditions where there's too much to do is that, well, you do two things which are sort of paradoxical in combination. One is you have some sense of where you're going, overall. And that's partly why I developed that future authoring program, to help people come up with a decent 3 to 5 year vision. And then as the stress mounts, I think you have to narrow your time frame more and more. So I went through a period of time, for example, where one of my family members was very ill for a prolonged period of time, and that combined with just the necessities of busy daily life, renovations, job, that sort of thing, got to be too much. And so what you do under those circumstances, as far as I can tell, is you set aside some time where you don't think about it. You don't talk about it. Maybe you don't think about it or talk about it after 9 o'clock at night or after 8:30 at night or something like that, knowing full well that you're going to attend to it immediately the next day.
Yeah.
But you need a long-term management strategy, and some of that is making sure that you don't exhaust yourself, right? Because that's the crucial thing. You can't exhaust yourself, because then everything falls apart. So that's no good.
Yeah. And
then the other thing I think you do is you concentrate even more intently on the day. And so you wake up, you think, okay, there's a set number of things I have to do so that by the end of the evening, I'm not farther behind. And then you attend to those, and that's a good enough day. And then, you think, well, the same thing the next day. I'll get up, I'll make a mental list at least of what I need to do so I don't fall behind. You can't think across weeks and months when you're overloaded, because that's just too much complexity.
Yeah.
Burn you out.
Right.
And I think when things get really serious, like super serious, you don't even start thinking about the whole day. You think about the next hour.
Yeah.
Maybe even the next 10 minutes. Because what you're surrounded by too much complexity, and it's too demanding. And so you just shorten the space across your moves. And that has the additional advantage of focusing you very intensely on the present, which is where you need to be focused, because the present, there's a lot to do in the present.
Yeah.
I also found one of my techniques for keeping up with when things are too demanding is that I turn to speed as much as quality. Often there are ways of doing things much faster if what you do is make the work fit the time rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's like, well, I have this thing to do, maybe to write. It should take me 2 weeks, but I've got 20 minutes. Like that's what I've got. And so then you write what you can in 20 minutes. And the funny thing is frequently, but not always, it's good enough.
Yeah.
And often fast and done is better than done well and delayed.
Right.
Very often, very, very often that's the case.
Yeah.
So, you talk about shortcuts, and sometimes, a shortcut means you've left something undone that'll come back to haunt you.
Yes.
That's because that's a downhill pathway. But if the shortcut is just, well, you did something acceptably but not excellently, well, sometimes that's because speed is often a demand. Sometimes that is the best you can do.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that it's also worth noting that it's not surprising that you're in that situation.
Yeah,
right?
no kidding.
Well, you actually don't have, it's not a psychological problem. You've got 3 kids, you've got a job, you've got a bunch of animals. Like
Yeah.
your time is well occupied. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I thought you were gonna tell me that I got myself into this mess. Because sometimes I feel
No, that mess is called life.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
And my observation of people often is that they're either doing too much or nothing.
Right.
It's very rare that you see someone, very, very rare, that you encounter someone who's doing the right amount,
Yeah. It's difficult, as a human to get that right, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's partly because no matter how much you do, it's not enough.
Okay. So that's normal then.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Especially with kids, because there's always, you could be paying more attention to the kids, for crying out loud,
Yeah.
always.
Yeah.
And you've got 3 little kids, that.
Yeah.
So, and they're very attention, like their currency is attention.
Yes.
They love adult attention because it's so valuable.
Yeah.
So they're always hungry for more of it. And yeah, no, I think when I heard you say what you said, I thought, oh, well, good, he's got a life. That was my initial response.
Oh, that's good to know.
I doubt if you're bored very often.
I'm not bored. I feel a little bit dissatisfied, and I've been trying to figure out how to solve that. And I figured out.
What are you dissatisfied about?
Well, I'll tell you what satisfies me. What satisfies me is something like playing soccer, right? Playing a soccer game where for an hour or 2 hours I have a very physical goal that I can focus on with teammates, and I have the freedom to meet that goal.
Well, one thing I would say, because I've helped people design strategies to cope with excessively busy lives, is that this is back to the don't exhaust yourself philosophy. It's the same philosophy that says, if the aircraft goes down, you put your oxygen mask on and then your child's oxygen mask.
Yeah.
In that order.
Yeah.
It may be that you actually need to do that. And by need, I mean that if you don't do that, you won't be as functional across the medium to long term.
Yeah.
And so if you find that rejuvenating, then it's conceivable that you need to elevate it in your importance hierarchy.
Yeah.
And even though it seems like something that's dispensable, because it's pleasurable and it's because it's not self-evidently crucial, the fact that you're responding to it emotionally that way might easily be an indication that you need to do that as a form of leisure.
Right.
Because it's going to help you pursue your other goals. As I have learned too, is that generally speaking, when people are extraordinarily busy, if they plan leisure time, they get more efficient rather than less. So you could say, well, I can't afford to take 2 hours a week off to go soccer, but then you might note that if you took 2 hours a week off to play soccer, you'd be 3 hours more efficient.
Right.
And so you could have your cake and eat it too. Maybe you wouldn't spend 3 hours a month fighting with your wife unnecessarily or something like that because you're, just that much less irritable.
Yeah.
But the fact that, you had that in your mind so quickly when I asked you the question about dissatisfaction and satisfaction means that you have a strong intuition about what it is that you need to introduce.
Yeah.
And that could easily be. I would take that seriously.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like this whole being emotionally dissatisfied, even though, I have a really nice life and no crazy trauma or anything like that. No one close to me is really sick or anything. I have a pretty lucky streak right now for the most part.
Yeah.
It seems like it's about that. I was just listening to one of your personality lectures on neuroticism. you talk about it all the time, and it's complex, and I can't really articulate it well, but basically the reward cycle in our body for, I think it helps us with survival, but basically if you're out hungry and you start to hunt and then you kill an animal, you feel very good emotionally, especially when you start to eat the animal, right? So it's like an incentive system that's baked in that the modern world kind of makes a little bit unintuitive for us, I think. Is that kind of what I'm trying to manage here? Is that reward system, the...
Well, I think part of the issue is just an issue of complexity. You know, you have a lot of responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And one of the prices that modern people pay, like, there is good evidence that people in less developed countries are happier than people in more developed countries.
Right.
But they're not as healthy, and they don't live as long, and their standard of living is much lower.
Yeah.
And so you might say, well, what price do industrialized people pay for their comfort? And I would say they pay the price of constant vigilance and responsibility, because what you have is not easy to maintain. Now, it's good, it's high quality, as you just pointed out, but it takes a lot of juggling to keep all the balls in the air. And that's stress that's associated, I would say, partly with conscientiousness, and also partly with negative emotion. But responsibility is no trivial matter. It's meaningful, but that doesn't mean that it isn't demanding. It's very demanding. And I guess the other thing I would say is and you did a good job of it right off the bat, is that it's a good thing to remind yourself of how many things are going well for you. And I'm sure reading the Gulag Archipelago is a good impetus to that. It's like, man, things could be a lot worse.
Yeah, it's funny that book, it comforts me, I guess. And that's strange.
That's strange, eh?
It is strange.
Yeah, but I know exactly what you mean. It's useful. It helps calibrate your nervous system, knowing what's really terrible.
That's interesting.
You know, I think that's why when young men are initiated in archaic, in the traditions of more archaic people, they're really put through the grinder. And I think the reason for that is so that their nervous systems then know for the rest of their life what the difference is between trouble and inconvenience. It's sort of like there's this theory now that many kids have asthma and autoimmune diseases because their early environments were too hygienic.
Yeah.
And their immune systems are adapted to assume a certain level of pathogen. And so if you keep the environment too clean, then the immune system gets too sensitive. And I kind of think the same thing as with regards to calibration of uncertainty and anxiety. You know, if you haven't been exposed to something truly dangerous, your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a catastrophe and an inconvenience. And reading something like the Gulag Archipelago, well, it obviously isn't the same as living through it. It's also not nothing. It does give you, for me, for example, it gave me a great appreciation of the tremendous functionality of our society and the staggering degree to which it's built on honesty and trust. It's amazing. It's a miracle. I can't believe it can even exist. It doesn't seem possible to me that it can exist. But it's difficult to be appreciative of that unless you understand that many societies run on almost nothing but lies.
Yeah.
And how terrible that is. And it's terrible look, those poor people in the Soviet Union, they couldn't even talk to their family members.
Yeah.
I don't think they could even listen to their own thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, because if you live in utopia, but you're still suffering, then your pain itself is an unpatriotic act.
That's so foreign to me. It's hard for me to even empathize with that situation. You know, it's...
Yeah, well, thank God.
Yeah, really. It's funny.
I mean, I've seen families like that, you know, where there's so much deception and often multi-generational, that no one knows which way is up or down, and no one can ever say what they really think.
Yeah.
You know, they're a little microcosm of totalitarianism. It's really horrible. Everyone's sick and everyone's angry and everyone's bitter and like it's just monstrous.
Yeah. Hey, this guy's name is Silin, Silin. Solzhenitsyn said he had 20,000 words or lines memorized. It's pretty profound, the stuff that Solzhenitsyn remembered. I think 2 or 3 of his poems and put them in the book. I don't know if he made it out and wrote anything down. That guy, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, he comments on the terrible losses that, you know, civilization itself suffered because of all the great people that were incarcerated in the camps and destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty damaging stuff, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're still suffering from it. I mean, Russia is still in dire straits in many ways. I think it's better than it was, but it's good. And, you know, one of the consequences of the Stalinist system was that, as Solzhenitsyn points out, is that the criminals were allowed to run everything.
Yeah.
And they got really good at it. And so, you know, you don't know the degree to which...
Well, and that's Russia, right?
Well, it's certainly Russia more than it is the West.
Yeah.
Where most of our institutions are fundamentally honest. I mean, look at our banks. Your banks don't steal your money.
Yeah.
They might make mistakes with it.
Well,
you know, and people at the top skim, especially if there are crooked people who skim, but fundamentally, you don't have to walk into your bank with an air of distrust, which is quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah.
And they almost never make a mistake.
It seems really dangerous how little people appreciate that.
It is really dangerous because it's so miraculous that it exists. Like, one of the things that I consider almost unbelievably unlikely is the success of enterprises like eBay, or Kijiji for that matter, where people who don't know each other, who are completely separated geographically, can engage in really high volume trading of everything, and it always works.
Yeah.
You know, now there's reputation tracking built into eBay now, but there wasn't to begin with, and still the level of mutual satisfaction between the traders was unbelievably high, and it's because by and by large, like 99% of the time, or maybe even more, people were dead honest in their dealings.
Yeah,
so
that's super surprising.
That's amazing, man.
Yeah. I meant to in the beginning thank you. Truly, like, you've helped me personally. The Maps of Meaning series especially kind of helped me just crawl out of like this nihilistic pit that I had dug for myself over the last 10 years or so.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. I mean, that's what those archetypal stories are for, you know. You need them because they orient you.
So
people need them.
I feel like I'm just at the beginning of starting to digest those stories and be able to use them and believe them and stuff. But you pointed out, you said something like, if you know anyone who's going through an existential crisis, they're thinking too much and they're not paying enough attention.
Mm-hmm.
And that was extremely helpful to me. It was just kind of like being called out for some really silly behavior, you know? It was extremely helpful.
It's a distinction that isn't commonly made. You know, so for example, if people are socially anxious, one of the things that really helps them is you teach them when they go to a social event to pay a lot of attention to the people they're talking to. You don't teach them to suppress their anxious thoughts.
Yeah.
They have to do something instead of ruminating, and what they need to do is pay attention, because if they pay attention, then they start to act properly, because most socially anxious people know how to act, they're just too nervous to do it. Now, sometimes you get people who don't know how to act, and you have to train them. You know, those are people who are really badly socialized.
Yeah.
and they just have no social skills. But most socially anxious people, they're perfectly fine if they pay attention. And attention is, attention helps with many things. It's also something,
Well, another thing that goes along with that, and I think that you connected these things somehow in those lectures. I mean, there's a lot going on in those lectures, and you composed it very well. It was extremely helpful and concise, and somehow, it didn't take forever to get the message. As you mentioned I guess how silly it is to believe that you can think scientifically all of the time, especially about the experiences in your life and your emotions and things like that. That helped a lot too. If you really start to pay attention to that, then you realize that you are holding beliefs and you're depending on group beliefs and you're depending on other people's beliefs. It's just that they're talking about science or the universe or something like that. But you can't actually really comprehend those things down to the fine detail of it. So no matter what, you have to have a representation. You have to have a model. I guess that's kind of one of the things.
Well, that's yes. So two things is one is that your knowledge is necessarily limited. So at some point you're taking things on faith.
Yeah.
And second, and I believe this to be the case, is that mere aggregation of facts doesn't tell you how to act. Now, Sam Harris, for example, would disagree, but I think that he's technically incorrect because there is a very large number of ways of grouping any set of facts, and so it isn't obvious that they can provide you with an unerring action. It's sort of, to me, it's like looking across a plain from a mountaintop and expecting the plain to tell you which way to walk through it.
Right.
It presents many, many opportunities to walk through. It doesn't privilege one over the other. You have to do that, and that idea goes back at least to Immanuel Kant, who was the first philosopher to point out, I would say, the limitations of pure reason or even pure empiricism, is that there has to be an a priori structure to the world, and believes that we're a blank slate. But if facts spoke for themselves, we could be a blank slate because we would be born with no structure and the world would just tell us what to do. Yeah. But that isn't what we're like. We have a tremendously coherent internal structure and we impose that structure on the world all the time. And I think that structure is best manifested to our understanding as these great stories. That's what it looks like to me.
I haven't found anything else that helped me as much as that did. And it seems like other people have. Other people, they've used the Bible and that worked for them. And I guess I needed a little more context, I suppose, that no one was able to provide.
Well, part of it is that I think biblical stories, the traditional, say, let's call it fundamentalist religious structures, work better for people who are not particularly critically minded and quite traditional in their thinking.
Yeah.
Because the stories work on an archetypal level and they can be sufficient, but if you question them, first of all, you can question them, and if you question them intelligently, and especially if you question them intelligently with the tools of the modern rational mind at hand, then they cease to work because you tear the foundation out from underneath them, and then they don't work anymore. Then you have to seek a different kind of understanding, and we're early stages of developing that, I would say, and one of the path breakers for that was certainly Jung and Freud too, to some degree, but you, the person who really started to map out the psychological significance of the great guiding myths. And I've been trying to extend his intuitions into and incorporate them into the field of neuroscience and philosophy and all of that. And many people seem to find that extremely helpful. It's certainly been extremely helpful for me.
Yeah. How much time do you have?
Well, we should stop pretty soon because I have to prepare for this. I have to continue to prepare for this Linfield talk tonight, and I'm somewhat apprehensive about that because I don't know how rife with protesters it will be. I mean, I don't really mind if there are protesters, but it does make me nervous because it is a confrontation of sorts, and so I also like to be prepared for the talk.
Yeah,
so we should stop in about 3 or 4 minutes, I would say.
Okay. One last thing is that you have mentioned, and I don't know how baked this I don't know how well you've articulated this to yourself yet. I don't know. I would love if you talked more about it, but you say that you were saying to Sam Harris, I've heard you say this elsewhere, but the way you try to behave is in a way that would optimize for all dominance hierarchies across all possible situations across time.
Yes.
That's
my
extremely
extension
profound.
of Piaget's equilibrated state, yes.
Equilibrated state, okay.
Yeah, an equilibrated state. It's like, this is also, I mean, Sam talks about well-being as his goal, the goal in him. I don't think he's thought that through very carefully, certainly not from the scientific perspective, because we simply don't know how to measure well-being properly because we don't even know how to define it, let alone measure it. But Piaget's sense, I think, is quite useful, even though it's difficult to make it concrete. Piaget thought that a game that two children played voluntarily was a better game than a game that one child forced the other to play.
Yeah.
And the reason he believed that, in part, was because he believed that the excess energy and time and resources that it took to enforce the enforced game crippled it compared to the voluntary game. And I really like that. That's a smart argument, man. So the idea would be that you and I will get a lot farther together if we cooperatively establish a goal and voluntarily decide to pursue it than if I twist your arm. Like, I can make you do what I want, but you're not going to operate at peak efficiency, and I'm going to have to use a lot of energy keeping an eye on you.
Yeah.
And so you can extend that, and Piaget did extend that to some degree, to say, well, it'd be good if I could play a game that was good for me, but it would even be better if I could play a game that was good for me, just as good, and also for you. Or maybe if I managed to play a game that was good for me and for you, it would even be better for me. And then you can extend that to your other relationships, and then you can extend that, across time, and you can extend it up to larger connections of, or larger social structures, and hope that all of that can be balanced. And that's a vision, it's a vision of optimal functioning. But what's wrong with that? It's like fulfilled individuals within functional families, within well-managed towns, within honest, productive states, within countries that are free and productive, in a world community that's cooperating towards, the ultimate good of mankind. That's a nice thing to keep in mind as a vision. That's the kingdom of God, as far as I'm concerned. And as far as I'm concerned as well, we don't really have anything better to do than pursue that. Now, I think the way you should pursue it is locally. You fix up your own life, right, with what you have at hand around you, because that's sort of the humble thing to do. Because you should fix up what you know you can fix, and leave the rest be until you're expert enough to risk messing with it. And I think part of what's wrong with the way children are being taught now, and university students as well, is that they're taught that the fundamental problems exist at a social level, and that the right way to behave ethically is to move rapidly to transform the social level. And I don't buy that. I think that that's an abdication of personal responsibility, and both for personal insufficiency, so there's no responsibility for personal insufficiency, and it's also a sacrifice of the moral task that's at hand. It's like, it's funny, I had a girl come up to me the other day after one of my talks, and she said she was really happy to be there. And she told me that watching my lectures had changed her life, and like people tell me that a lot. But she said something very specific, and she said, it started with your advice to clean up your room. She said she started to clean up her room, and then she said that she realized that her room wasn't just her room, that it was part of her, and that it was a microcosm of everything else. And I thought, great, man, she got it. She figured it out,
Yeah.
because that's exactly right. And if you can organize a small area, then you've learned in principle how to organize a larger area. And well, then you can start doing that. And simultaneously, as you organize the small area, you're also uncluttering not so much your mind, but your being. And that's an excellent thing to do. It's the pathway to clarity. And there's nothing but good in that. So that's probably a good place to stop.
Thank you very much. I wish you luck tonight.
Thank you.
I hope you have tons of support from people all over the world.
Yes, thank God. I do know that, and it is extremely reassuring.
That's good.
So, and it's been vital, because I would have been in big trouble in the university had that not happened. So, thank God for that. So, and yes, if you'd like to release this was a very productive discussion, so feel free.
Okay, thank you.
If you email me, I'll tweet it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. It was good meeting you.
All right, sir. From the bottom of my heart, thank you again.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.